Homage to the Buddha, homage to the Dharma, homage to the Sangha. In the time of the Buddha, there was a government minister who had performed some deed or other for the state and was given the reward of being king for a week. That is, to enjoy the position of being king without any of the responsibilities. So he got to ride the royal elephant, wear the royal turban, and drink the royal wine, in which he got rather inebriated, and watch the royal entertainment, which included, of course, dancing troupes. And he became somewhat infatuated with one of the dancers. In any case, in the middle of all of this, feeling the after effects, he went down to the river, seated on the royal elephant, in order to have a bath in the river. And on his way down, he was so preoccupied, and as I said, probably a little drunk or a little hungover, that when he saw Shakyamuni Buddha standing alongside the riverbank, he just simply turned to the side and did a, half gasho or whatever, and continued on his way. And the Buddha remarked to Ananda, that fellow will be back before the end of the day. So the minister attended the festivities into the evening. And one of the dancers, having dieted herself and in order to be at her best, sounds like a contemporary difficulty, and probably suffering from what we would call an underlying health problem, she fell down and with either a stroke or a heart attack and died in the middle of the dancing. And it says that she died with her mouth and eyes open. She died very, very suddenly. The minister was completely distraught. And while seated on the royal elephant and wearing all the jewelry, and as I say, still a bit inebriated, took off to see the Buddha, to ask the Buddha for help. And usually in those days, before somebody went and saw a spiritual teacher, they would remove their jewelry and finery. And of course, they would walk rather than go on the royal elephant. But while in the middle of enjoying the royal prerogatives and seated on the elephant, this minister asked the Buddha about what had happened. And the Buddha said, the tears you have shed in the past existences over this same circumstance are more than all the waters of all the oceans. The clinging on to causes suffering. The minister, there and then, seated on the royal elephant, wearing the royal clothes, in the very middle of as much worldly activity as you can imagine, penetrated to the truth and went all the way and became an arhat. Another person who studied with the Buddha was a woman who practiced the way with the Buddha and was cooking. And if you can imagine her probably seated on the ground, as people did, with a type of oven next to her made of clay and plastered, on which there would be various openings, and she would be burning the usual cow dung fuel. And she had a type of wok. Um, it's a vessel, a curved metal vessel. And she had a wok set up on the flames. And what she was going to do, which was a usual thing to do, was to parch some mustard greens to crumple up and add to the dish that she was making. She looked away for a second. And when she looked back, the heat had burnt up the greens, turned them into cinders. And she had deep insight into the very nature of impermanence. Went deeply into the wisdom of the Dharma. And there's more about her life in the Pali Canon, but I will come to that particular point. Another person in the time of the Buddha was a short, hunchback woman who was employed in this particular household. Um, and one of her jobs was to go every morning to the marketplace, the early marketplace, in order to purchase flowers, which of course were absolute necessity for an Indian household. Flowers for religious offerings, flowers for people to wear, flowers to decorate everything. She'd been doing this for a number of years, and she had found a source of flowers that was very cheap. And so what she used to do was buy the flowers and pocket the change. One day, as she was returning or going to the market, she saw Shakyamuni Buddha teaching, and she stopped to listen. This caused her to realize the mistake she was making and the significance of it by pocketing the change, which didn't really belong to her. So she went back to her employer and told her what she'd been doing. And her employer was very impressed with her honesty and with the impact of the teaching of the Buddha on her. So her employer asked her to go every day to listen to the Buddha teaching and to come back to the household and repeat what she had heard. And this she did each day, resulting in the deep understandings of the women of the household to whom she taught the Dharma, repeated the teaching of the Buddha. Eventually, she passed away, and the people to whom she'd repeated the words of the Buddha handed them down. And when the teachings of the Buddha were gathered together, and this was all done orally, At the Second Council, the people who had heard her um, convey the teaching of the Buddha brought those teachings, those verses of the Buddha, to the council, and they were incorporated within the Buddhist scriptures. A lot of Buddhist scriptures start off with the words, "Thus have I heard at one time," which are the words of Ananda. And in this case, the "thus have I heard at one time" are the words of this particular woman. Another person in the time of the Buddha had renounced the world and become a monastic. And unless I'm mixing up my stories in my memory, was old and was returning to her meditation cell or whatever where she lived. And these come from her own words. She entered the room, and the monastic rule says that if you're going to sit down on a bed or chair, you should turn all the way around and examine it just to make sure that there aren't scorpions or snakes or some creature sitting on it. And if you know yourselves, as I'm sure you do, you can just see her situation. No doubt she would have thought to herself, "Oh gosh, it's late. I want to go to bed. Why do I have to turn all the way around and look at that seat?" But she did do so. In other words, practicing one of the very essences of training, to do something that is good to do, no matter how one feels about it. Then she sat down on the bed and grasped the wick of the oil lamp, the little wheel, and turned down the wick into the oil to turn the lamp off. And she said, "The great dark split apart," was the word she used for what happened. Each of these people were living ordinary lives. They were not doing a form of extraordinary asceticism, nor were any of them doing things like weeks and weeks of meditation. And all realized the way in the very middle of activities, in the very middle of their daily lives. It is a common koan now among lay trainees in general, Buddhist lay trainees in the West, and one sees it frequently in Buddhist popular magazines. People write letters to the editor saying, "How can I possibly train in the Dharma if I have to live my life as it is? How can I possibly train in the Dharma unless I can afford to go to long retreats? How can I possibly train in the Dharma unless I can afford to have nice altar furnishings? How can I possibly train in the Dharma unless I go long distances to India to receive special teaching?" Our tradition is not called farmers Zen for nothing. That means that one doesn't have to have a university degree, nor have read a lot, nor be particularly erudite, nor come from a particular social class, nor have leisure time in order to practice the Dharma. One of the more famous people who lived in the Buddha's time, which you all may have heard of, is Kissa Gotami. Gotami was her family name, and Kissa was a sort of nickname. It meant thin. Now, Kissa Gotami was born into a poor family without much social standing. And she married into a more wealthy family. Her in-laws despised her for her background. And when she had a son born to her, this greatly improved her standing among the in-laws. She doted on her child and carried her child everywhere with her. Her child became ill, maybe with something like cholera or dysentery or any of the other diseases that in particular carried off children in those days. Kissa Gotami panicked. One can see that this was related as well to the fact that her son represented everything to her, including her status in the family. So she went from place to place trying to find medicine. Now, in those days, when one went to a doctor, the doctor would give you a prescription. Actually, that's like today too. And you would go away and get the medicine and bring it back to the doctor, and the doctor would tell you how to use it. And there would be usual instructions to go with the medicine. And so Kissa Gotami became completely distraught. And unable to find any help, some kind person suggested that she should go and talk to Shakyamuni. They may have even said, that man is a great physician. Go and talk to him. So Kissa Gotami went to talk to the Buddha. And the Buddha said, you must get mustard seed. White, I think, white mustard seed. And you must get it from a house, because she would have gone from house to house, because everybody had mustard seed. You must get it from a house where nobody has ever died. Now, she wouldn't have thought this an unusual set of circumstances. So she set off to get the mustard seed. But she soon discovered that death is more common than life. And every house she stopped at, somebody in the family had passed away at some time or another. In the interim, her child had passed away. This part in the story is of immense importance, in the same way as the woman turning all the way around and looking at her seat, and the woman who was cooking, who looked away for a second, and whose insight was due to her being still and not doing the usual thing of blaming the food, blaming the fire, blaming the oven, blaming somebody else, or blaming herself. And instead, she sat still. And the minister, who, even though inebriated at the moment of the encounter with the death of the woman, had deep insight into impermanence and only required the teaching of the Buddha to open this up. Back to Kisagotami. Kisagotami realized that her own suffering was not the only suffering going on in the world. And this realization is of utmost importance because it is the very basis of Buddhist ethics. Ethics in Buddhism, precepts, are not based upon something given by an external deity, nor are they based on something handed down by a series of prophets. They rather arise, the precepts arise out of our realization that we are the same as all beings, that just as all beings fear death and fear suffering, so do we. This is one of the most important insights that a trainee can have. It is why that when somebody comes to a teacher and is self-absorbed in their own suffering, it is often recommended that they go and do something for other people. Coming back to Kisagotami, she took the body of her dead child to the charnel grounds outside the town. The charnel grounds were those areas where dead bodies were put until they could be cremated. Unless the family could afford the cremation, the bodies were generally left to decay. This, of course, still happens, and there are still charnel grounds in India and in Thailand, etc. It's generally speaking, tourists are not told about them or taken to see them. So, Kisagotami came back to Shakyamuni. And Shakyamuni said, "Have you gotten the mustard seed?" And Kisagotami said, "Enough of this business of the mustard seed. Only grant me refuge." This is the pivotal point in the story. We have to say for ourselves, enough. of this business of the mustard seed. Enough of this business of wandering back and forth in samsara. Enough of this business of wasting time in quarreling. Years and years later, Kisagotami, having renounced the world, was sitting underneath a tree. I think she was, having finished her meal, when she said, as it were, she heard a voice. We might describe it as thoughts going through our minds. And the voice said, "What are you doing out here in the wilderness? Are you mourning over your child? Are you looking for a man?" And the story says that Kisagotami said to herself, "What is this? Where is this coming from?" And because they personified things in those days, she said to herself, "This is Mara seeking to distract me." And similarly, she said, "Enough of this business, enough of the past. Go and bother people who are still involved with such things." When we hear the stories of the people who lived in the Buddha's time, and to remind people these were actual people who existed, when we hear the stories, we can think of them, particularly when we hear about their penetrating to the way or the great dark opening. We can think that this is something that occurred a long time ago. And as Dogen says, we can think that this is for other people and not for ourselves, which Dogen called the most useless of all useless opinions. The Dharma is handed down for the sake of practice. The Dharma is handed down for the sake of our realizing it for ourselves. Not as theory, but to actually realize it for ourselves. Homage to all the Buddhas in all worlds, homage to all the Bodhisattvas in all worlds, homage to the scripture of great wisdom.